I hope that the various changes now being introduced into our policies on the use of funds resources will induce members to come to the fund for assistance whenever needed and without delay. As to the means of financing this new assistance policy, let me first stress that quotas must remain the fundamental source of the financing provided by the fund to its members. Quotas are the manifestation of the cooperation amongst government that constitutes the very essence of the fund. At this point, implementation of the 50% increase provided for by the 7th General Review of Quota is urgent. But even with this increase, the size of the deficits and the concentration of surpluses among a few members mean that the fund's liquidity would not enable us to implement the policy of enlarged access, which I have described a moment ago. By about the end of this year, the supplementary financing facility will be totally committed, and it will be necessary to have recourse to further borrowing as an interim method of financing. Preparatory work on the 8th General Review of Quotas is to begin soon with the Executive Board, but completion of the whole process will take time. I have, therefore, begun examining the possibilities of direct borrowing by the fund from members that are in a strong external position. The reaction I have had to date shows that these countries have a positive attitude to collaboration with the fund. The discussion continues. Furthermore, with the encouragement of the Executive Board, I am proceeding to explore other sources of financing, including market financing. In the coming months, it will be necessary to take decisions on these matters in order to assure the necessary continuity in the financing of our institution to meet the needs of our members. I am conscious that the fund's borrowed resources, Mr. Chairman, are expensive for its members to use, and this affects particularly members with low per capita incomes. Therefore, the fund has also undertaken to institute an interest subsidy account designed to decrease the cost of using the supplementary financing facility. Part of the resources to this account will be derived from the expected repayments of loans granted by the trust fund. I hope that another portion will come from voluntary contributions or loans, preferably on concessional terms, from countries which are in a position to participate in such operations. We have already initiated inquiries with a number of countries regarding their possible contributions. Some reply have been negative or are pending. We are therefore the more grateful to those countries which have given a positive reply, and I trust that decisive progress can be made in this matter before our next interim committee meeting in May in Gabon. In concluding these remarks on the fund's policies, Mr. Chairman, I would like to draw attention to one proposal under study in the Executive Board that I believe deserves particularly support. This is the suggestion that the fund should establish a food import facility which could alleviate the problems of countries, especially low-income countries, suffering from crop failures or sharp rises in food import costs. The scheme that has been studied appears workable and fully compatible with the revolving character of funds assistance, and its demand on our resources can be limited. Because of the present serious situation of the developing countries, I consider that an early and positive decision on this matter would be a manifestation of our concern for human issues. Mr. Chairman, my remarks so far have been directed to the most urgent problems faced by our member countries in the present economic situation. I have traced what I thought was a consistent set of policies aimed at securing some sustainable growth during this decade. I have explained how the fund, while retaining its special role, is adapting its policies to these new realities. My concluding remarks concern more broadly the future of the international monetary system. This is a fundamental question from which even the most urgent day-to-day concerns must not distract us. We live in a system that is under strain. There are nevertheless important and growing areas of stability and consensus in this system, and I will begin by saying a few words on these. First, the surge of inflation in the 70s provoked or hastened an increasing awareness of the importance of monetary discipline. By this, I do not mean a naive and mechanistic faith, but a growing recognition that continuous monitoring and restraint of monetary expansion is a necessary, though not at all sufficient, condition for sustainable growth. Monetary targets and the monitoring of monetary aggregates are now widespread in the industrial countries and increasingly so in the developing world. Second, in close relation to this, there has been over the last 2 years a greater degree of stability in the foreign exchange markets than most people would have dared to predict. This market has coped remarkably well with large shifts in deficits and surpluses and with other serious international tensions. The European monetary system is one example of this stability. And more generally, the principal world currencies have only in rare occasions fluctuated beyond a range conducive to appropriate balance of payments adjustment. Third, despite the regrettable failure to decide on the establishment of a substitution account, the fund's members have reaffirmed their conviction that a strong SDR should be the centerpiece of the international monetary system. The recent decision to simplify the SDR to a 5-currency basket will increase its use both by the private sector and by official holders. Furthermore, the Interim Committee has just requested the Executive Board to give early attention to the question of adjusting the SDR interest rate to the full market rate and of eliminating the remaining reconstitution requirement. Also, the importance of the SDR as a stable and attractive international reserve asset will continue to be enhanced through the fund's borrowing activities. I will turn now, Mr. Chairman, to those aspects of the system on which a consensus among members still needs to be built. The recent special session of the United Nations General Assembly heard interventions on a wide range of subjects of direct concern to the fund, including the creation and distribution of international liquidity, the link and the decision-making process in international financial institutions. Indeed, over the past decade, the fund has been engaged in a process of self-examination. This has continued intensively in recent months during the preparation of the reports for the Interim Committee on the Group of 24 Programme of Immediate Action and for the Development Committee on the Brandt Commission recommendations. One of the most important areas of study has been the creation and distribution of international liquidity. The allocation of SDRs was resumed in 1979 after a hiatus of 7 years. We will soon be actively discussing the question of new allocations in order to achieve a level of SDR holdings commensurate with the growth of world trade, the need for global liquidity, and the objective of reversing the falling share of SDRs in members' reserves. Discussion of the link between SDR allocations and development assistance has been resumed in the fund, and new approaches have been put forward, which we are going to study again. in greater detail after these meetings, alongside with the others. The issue of decision-making will be an important element underlying the impending 8th General Review of Quotas. The elements of the formula used in the calculation of funds quotas will be reviewed, and we shall have to work for selective increases in quotas that reflect the changing importance of countries and groups of countries in the world economy. In all our discussions and throughout the range of activities we pursue in the fund, we must ensure that all our members have a sense of real participation in the fund's affairs. These issues, Mr. Chairman, are not easy to resolve. The interrelated problems of inflation, slow growth, and energy confront the world economy with profound challenges. They call for a quality of creativity and an intensity of cooperation on the part of the international community that is almost unprecedented. Solutions will need to be worked out in a spirit of patience and day-to-day cooperation. I would emphasize, Mr. Chairman, that we are determined to address these issues directly and to arrive at solutions within the framework of the fund's basic objectives. The fund is a financial institution which, to survive, must serve its members in a practical and business-like way. Its operational response must be swift, and its financial policies must be sound. But the fund is also a collaborative institution, founded to promote cooperation between its member countries. If it is to play its full role at the center of the international monetary system, it must be capable of change. It must adapt itself to new realities. It must respond to the needs and to the aspirations of its membership. It is only in bringing together and blending these two strands in the fund's nature that we can successfully respond to the economic challenges of the difficult decade that we now face. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you, Mr. de Larosière. I now have the pleasure of calling on the President of the Bank, Mr. Robert McNamara, to make his annual address. Mr. McNamara.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I too should like to begin this morning by welcoming our new governors representing our new members, particularly the Governor of the People's Republic of China. We're very, very pleased to have them all with us. As the Chairman has said, this is the 13th and final address that I will have the privilege of making in this forum. What I have to say, therefore, will be particularly frank and candid, especially as it relates to the future role of the World Bank. Specifically this morning, I want to examine 4 subjects. First, the prospects for economic growth and social advance in the oil-importing developing countries throughout the 1980s. Secondly, the actions the developing societies themselves, as well as the industrialized nations and the OPEC countries, can take to maximize that growth. Thirdly, the need to accelerate the attack on absolute poverty. And finally, the role the World Bank itself ought to play in all of this in the decade ahead. For those of you who may be interested, a more detailed statement of my remarks in printed form will be available as you leave the room. Let me begin then with the current outlook. Both Mr. Jamal and Mr. de Larosière have already referred to that. Because it will shape the work of the bank in the years to come, I too wish to comment on it. Global economic prospects have seriously deteriorated since we met last year in Belgrade. The outlook now is that the oil-importing developing countries in the years ahead are going to have a very difficult time indeed. The bank is currently projecting for the decade of the 80s lower levels of economic growth in those countries than it did 12 months ago. The most probable outcome for at least the next 5 years is that the annual average per capita growth in the oil-importing developing countries, which was 3.1% in the 60s, 2.7% in the 70s, will drop in the next 5 years to below 2%, probably to something on the order of 1.75%. More depressing still is the outlook for the 1 billion people who live in the poorest countries. Their already desperately low per capita income, less than $220 per capita per year, is likely to grow by no more than 1% a year, an average of only $2 or $3 per person. There'd be even negative growth for the 140 million people in sub-Saharan Africa. Reflecting the changes in the external environment, the current account deficits of these countries have increased sharply. In 1980, they're expected to amount to almost 4% of their gross national product. Persistent deficits of this magnitude cannot be sustained indefinitely. In the short run, the deficits can be, and they are being, financed by additional external borrowing. But in the longer run, this will not suffice. At the levels involved, the mounting burden of debt service would soon become unsupportable. The countries will, therefore, have to make structural changes in their economies, changes that can enable them to pay from their own resources for the increasingly more expensive but necessary oil. And this can only be done by expanding their exports, or by reducing their imports, or by some combination of those two. If these changes are undertaken soon, if they can be undertaken and completed over the next 5 to 8 years, growth rates in the oil-importing developing countries should recover to more satisfactory levels in the second half of the decade. This, however, will require financial assistance beyond that now in prospect. If this financial assistance is not available, or if the developing countries delay initiating the necessary structural changes, their progress will be seriously compromised throughout the decade. Thus, each oil-importing country will have to design its own plan of structural adjustment. If exports are the dynamic sector in a particular country, the promising strategy would obviously be to stress further export expansion. If good possibilities exist for import substitution, as they clearly do in domestic energy production, these ought to be pursued. Let me comment briefly on domestic energy production in these oil-importing countries. It can make a very substantial contribution to the adjustment process. To understand that, one need only reflect that even if their domestic energy production expands in future years at the rate of the past decade, their oil import bill, which was $32 billion in 1978, in 1990 would be close to $300 billion. And that's a level which is unlikely to be financed by any conceivable expansion of exports or any increase in external borrowing. Although the sharp rise in world prices of oil has put considerable strain on the balance of payments of the developing countries, it has also changed the economics of domestic energy production and changed them dramatically. At current and prospective oil prices, many oil-importing developing countries can now turn what were previously regarded as marginal reserves of oil, gas, coal, hydroelectric, and forest resources into commercial propositions. If they maximize domestic energy production between now and the end of this decade, we estimate that these countries could cut their annual oil import bill by $50 billion. $50 billion per year. So what we propose is this. The oil importing developing countries should establish efficient import substitution in energy as one of their principal tasks for the 80s. They should draw up concrete national energy plans and formulate specific domestic investment programs. These in turn should be backed by newly mobilized domestic resources and most importantly by additional external assistance, including additional assistance from the World Bank, which I will discuss in a moment. As I've indicated, there is an urgent demand for more external funds if the developing countries are to manage the adjustment process, including the expansion of energy production, without avoidable and hence unnecessary penalties to their economic growth, their social progress, and their people. Let me turn to that subject now, dealing first with the requirements of the low-income countries. A major expansion in the concessional flows to these countries is required in the 80s for them to support their adjustment programs. And what are the prospects for that expansion? In a single word, poor. Total official development assistance, ODA, including that from OPEC countries, did not increase in the 1977-79 period. In real terms, it declined, and the outlook for the future is not bright. Recent actions give cause for concern. By 1985, the aid cuts announced by the British government could cause their ODA in relation to GNP to fall by nearly a quarter from the average for 1977-79. Aid bills continue to face difficulties in the U.S. Congress, suggesting that support from the largest donor is likely to remain the lowest relative GNP of all major industrial nations. Germany and Japan have indicated their intention to continue to improve their aid flows, but most donors have not committed themselves to increasing the share of GNP allotted to concessional assistance. And I think what's even more disappointing, the portion of these ODA flows that was allocated to the low-income countries, which of course needed the most, was shockingly small in both absolute and relative terms. It amounted to less than 1/2 of the total. And on a per capita basis, although it's hard to believe, the low-income countries receive less concessional assistance than do the middle and high-income countries. The needs of these poorest countries are well known. It's not a time to temporize with this problem. It is a time to act. At the very minimum, each donor country should maintain its ODA at the same percentage of GNP as it did in 1978. And those countries which are well below the present OECD average should increase their aid faster than their GNP grows. All of the donor countries should increase the share that the low-income countries will receive in their individual allocations. I want to turn now to the external financial requirements of the middle-income oil-importing countries. Between 1978 and 1980, these requirements will have more than doubled in absolute terms and nearly doubled in relative terms. Commercial banks, of course, constituted by far the most dynamic element of capital flows to these countries in the 70s. The chief anxiety today is that the commercial banks may not be able to play a similar role in the 80s. This doesn't mean that the commercial flows to developing countries will not expand in the 80s. They will. But the key question is this: will they expand enough to permit the adjustment process in these countries to take place at relatively high rather than at unacceptably low growth rates? In all probability, they will in 1980 and perhaps even in 1981. But beyond 1981, they well may not. Already, leading commercial bankers in both Western Europe and North America have expressed their doubts. It's not too early, therefore, to discuss action to supplement and to facilitate the role of the commercial banks if these doubts materialize. This should be a major focus of the work of the Development Committee and of the boards of the Monetary Fund and the World Bank in the year to come. If the task of recycling to the developing countries a portion of the surplus of the capital surplus oil exporters is to be tackled efficiently, and if it's to be tackled equitably in the 1980s, there's not the slightest doubt that the financial intermediation by the Bretton Woods institution should increase substantially above presently planned levels. I'll comment in a moment on a possible role for the World Bank in all of this. But before turning to that, I want to re-emphasize an underlying issue which I think is in danger today of being obscured by the anxiety over the global adjustment problem. And that's the most fundamental development issue of all, the drive against absolute poverty. Over the past decade, I've drawn attention repeatedly in this forum, sometimes I fear at the risk of tedium, to the principal goals of development, to accelerate economic growth, and to eradicate what I've termed absolute poverty. These two goals are related, though governments are sometimes tempted to pursue one without adequate attention to the other. In the end, that approach fails from a development point of view. The pursuit of growth without a reasonable concern for equity is ultimately socially destabilizing. And the pursuit of equity without a reasonable concern for growth merely tends to redistribute the deprivation of economic stagnation. Neither pursuit taken by itself can lead to sustained, successful development. Both are indispensable. When we met here together in 1972, I began a discussion of these issues with you. I pointed out that all too little of the benefits of economic growth was reaching the bottom 40% of the population in the developing world. For 800 million individuals, their countries were moving forward in gross economic terms, but their own individual lives were standing still in human terms. As our analysis of growth and equity continued in these meetings in subsequent years, we outlined a number of specific actions designed to deal directly with the problem in the context of overall development planning. It was clear that any successful effort to combat poverty would have to do two basic things: assist the poor to increase their productivity and assure their access to essential public services. In each of the following years, our discussion pursued these issues further. But now, as I've pointed out this morning, most of the developing countries are facing a new and unanticipated, and what's certain to be for the next several years, a very difficult situation. Their rates of growth are going to be low, their capital requirements are going to be high, there are going to be severe pressures on their governments to adopt austere budget allocations for every activity that's not considered of immediate priority. In these circumstances, the temptation will be strong to push aside and to postpone anti-poverty programs. The argument will be that poverty is a long-term problem, that current deficits are a short-term emergency, that poverty can wait, but deficits cannot. I think that's a very specious argument. Mounting deficits cannot be indefinitely postponed. And as we've seen, the necessary solution does lie in structural adjustment. Efforts to get that adjustment in place must not indeed be delayed. But absolute poverty in a society cannot be indefinitely sustained either. To ignore it, to temporize with it, to downgrade its urgency, under the convenient excuse that the solution is long-term and that there are other immediate problems with higher priority, I think is dangerous self-deception. No government, of course, wants to perpetuate poverty. But not all governments, at a time of depressed economic growth, are persuaded that there is much they can really do against so vast a problem. I think there is. In the printed text, I pointed in particular to the synergistic effects on productivity and hence on national income of actions designed to meet basic needs in each of the 5 priority areas: education, health, clean water, nutrition, shelter. Our research in the bank during the past year has shown how this may be done, even in periods of budget stringency, through redesign and restructuring of social programs. The economic return of such actions can be huge, and the same is true of other investments in the immense untapped human potential of the absolute poor. Even in a period of austerity, and indeed I think especially in a period of austerity, these investments must be accelerated. Now I want to turn to the role the World Bank itself might play in the 80s. Let me summarize first the program the bank has undertaken over the past decade. During the past year, the bank group has expanded dramatically its level of financial assistance to the developing world. In the fiscal year just ended, its new financial commitments totaled $12 billion. That compares with $1 billion in 1968. And our 5-year operating program calls for commitments in 1985 of $20 billion. But our objective during these years has not been principally to increase the size of the bank's operation. We didn't simply want to do more. Rather, we wanted to do more of what could contribute most to our member countries' evolving development needs. And thus, over the past decade, there's been a major qualitative change in the bank's lending and in its development policies. That change arose out of the understanding that if the absolute poor had to wait for the benefits of growth to trickle down to them, their incomes and their welfare would inch forward at an intolerably slow pace. It became clear that developing countries needed to devise policies and investment programs to assist the poor in their societies to become more productive and to assure an equitable distribution of essential services to them. Throughout the 70s, the bank made a determined effort to help its member countries to devise such policies and to finance and implement them. It's devoted to this objective a high proportion of the intellectual resources and a growing share of its expanded lending. In the 1964-68 period, such loans amounted to only $60 million per year. They accounted for less than 5% of total lending. In this past year, they had grown to $3.5 billion, and they accounted for about 30% of total lending. As a matter of fact, in that year, the bank approved agricultural and rural development projects designed to raise the productivity and hence to nearly double the income of some 29 million individuals, including 18 million of the world's poorest. And as well, these projects were designed to increase cereal grain production about 6 million tons a year. By raising its overall level of lending, the bank was able to meet its member countries' new requirements without neglecting their traditional needs. And I think that clearly remains the path for the future. The bank must be in a position to respond to new needs which have already appeared, and it will certainly be called upon again and again to respond to needs which we cannot yet foresee. It must be able to do so without disrupting other programs for which developing countries are counting upon its assistance. Now, is the bank in such a position at this time? Last year, I reported to you we were making progress in laying a foundation for future expansion of the bank lending in the 80s. Now, let me summarize the steps which have been taken since that time. The general capital increase in the bank's authorized capital from $45 billion to $85 billion was approved by the Board of Governors in January. However, some countries, including the United States, will need legislative approval before they can subscribe to those additional shares. Negotiations for a sixth replenishment in the International Development Association, that is to say IDA, were concluded last December, and the basis for the replenishment was approved by the governors in March. But the replenishment itself is still not effective because a few countries, and in particular the United States, have not yet been able to complete the necessary legislation. Other donors have agreed to make voluntary contributions to prevent an extended hiatus in IDA's lending program. But I want to emphasize the importance of early action by all governments to make this replenishment effective and to avoid the severe penalties for the poorest nations of the world that will result from further delay and further uncertainty. However, let us assume that all the necessary legislative actions to put the capital increase and the replenishment in place occur. Will the lending program, which that capital increase and that replenishment is intended to support, will it be adequate for the role the bank must play in the 80s to assist its developing country members? Will it allow the bank to meet these countries' needs in even the limited way that we hoped it would when it was prepared? And the answer is no. The lending program for the next 5 years, 1981 to 85, reflects the bank's assessment of the future financial requirements of the developing countries as they appeared early in 1977 when that program was prepared. In the light of that assessment, we believe that the planned level of lending would permit the bank to increase its new commitments each year by about 5% in real terms, and that this projected growth would allow the bank to make an adequate contribution to its member countries' development needs. That assessment is no longer tenable. A rampant and an unexpected rate of inflation has reduced the real value of the commitments permitted by the capital increase and the IDA agreements. As a result, the value of the lending program planned for 1981 to 85 will fall 10% below what was projected. In today's dollars, this represents a loss of about $6 billion. Quite apart from this, our developing member countries' needs for bank assistance have increased for three other reasons, and let me briefly touch on those. First, additional financing is required for the much larger than anticipated current account deficits. To help meet these requirements, the bank introduced structural adjustment lending, as you know, several months ago. It's tentatively planning to commit between $600 million and $800 million for that purpose in this forthcoming year. In 1982 or 83, such lending might amount to $1.5 billion, and in subsequent years to more. At present, however, such structural adjustment loans have to be fitted into the previously planned lending program. But these new needs are clearly additional to the requirements identified in 1977, which this current program was designed to meet. The bank needs, therefore, to expand that program to respond to them. If it fails to do so, it simply will not be contributing to the solution of the world's intermediation problem. Now let me move to the second point, the financing required for energy development. Beyond their immediate impact on import costs, as I've indicated, the higher energy prices present both long-term challenges and opportunities for the oil-importing developing countries. And our studies indicate that at the new price levels, there are highly profitable investment opportunities in these countries, opportunities in addition to their current plans, and opportunities which, if seized upon, could reduce oil imports by over 3 million barrels per day by 1990. This would have obvious benefits for all countries, for the producing nations and for the consuming nations. But the exploitation of these opportunities will require substantial investment over the next 5 years. Investment requirements in these oil-importing developing countries during these 5 years will, we estimate, approximate $185 billion in 1980 dollars. That's roughly $100 billion more than was spent for that purpose in the past 5 years. Most of these needs will be financed by their own savings and by external sources other than the bank. The bank, however, should help by expanding its previously planned energy program, both to serve as a catalyst for other funds, particularly from private sources, and in order to finance those needs for which such funds are unlikely to be available. To assist in this role, we believe we should double our presently planned program, which is set at about $13 billion for energy development in the next 5 years, double it to approximately $25 billion. Now finally, let me turn to the matter of China. The change in the representation of China in the bank has increased by nearly 1 billion the number of people who now have a claim on the bank's resources. That claim is no less compelling, their needs are no less urgent than those of other bank members. It will take time to translate those needs into specific bank projects. But when that's been done, it's clear they will amount to several billions of dollars per year. If we had to accommodate those needs within the lending program planned earlier, we would have to reduce sharply our lending to other countries, and this would seriously disrupt their development programs. Clearly, we must not do that. An addition to the lending program is certainly required. The inescapable conclusion of all these circumstances is this: the bank must mobilize substantial additional resources if it is to effectively assist the developing countries through these critical years that lie ahead. But, and this is a point I particularly want to emphasize, but it must do this in a manner which takes full account of the current budgetary constraints faced by the governments of the developed nations. If we agree on this objective, and I believe we can, then our task is to find the means for financing the expansion in lending without imposing undue burdens on the budgets of our member governments. Several approaches to that seemingly impossible task are worthy of our consideration, and let me refer to some of them briefly. It's through the payments for capital subscriptions that the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD, places demands on the budgets of its member governments. Those budgets are tight, and the equity capital which they finance is therefore a very scarce resource. Loan funds, on the other hand, are available. They're even abundant in the world's financial markets. The issue facing the bank today, therefore, is whether we are making the best possible use of that very scarce resource, our equity capital, in order to mobilize these other more abundant funds. The question is, could we increase our borrowings in the private financial markets without imposing additional claims on scarce funds from governments? When the capital increase is completed, if the bank fully utilizes the authority provided by that increase, the bank's own paid-in equity and reserves will finance about 15% of outstanding loans, and when callable capital is added in, every single dollar of outstanding loans will be backed by a dollar of capital or reserves. These ratios contrast sharply with the practice of large commercial banks. And they raise the question, should not the World Bank improve the efficiency with which it uses its immensely broad and uniquely guaranteed financial base? Couldn't it begin to use the demonstrated strength of its loan portfolio, which reflects the prudent lending policies it's followed for over 30 years? This will be essential if it's to meet more fully the needs of the developing countries without imposing additional burdens on the budgets of other governments in a period when domestic demands on many of them are particularly strong. The question then is, how can this best be done, while at the same time fully safeguarding the strength and the integrity of the bank's financial structure? There are, I believe, at least 3 actions which could be considered. First, the relationship between the bank's loans and its equity base could be changed. The Articles of Agreement, drafted over 35 years ago in immensely different financial circumstances, provide that the bank's disbursed and outstanding loans cannot exceed its subscribed capital and reserves. The question that the Brandt Commission, investment bankers, and other financial experts have been asking us is this: in the circumstances of today, as contrasted with those in 1944, does it make financial sense to limit any increase whatever in the bank's lending authority to an equal increase in its capital? The tentative answer appears to be that the 1-to-1 ratio established at Bretton Woods in the closing months of World War II is no longer really relevant to the bank's financial condition or to the economic situation of its principal shareholders. And the result, therefore, may be an unnecessary underutilization of the bank's capital. A second possibility for financing an expansion of lending would be the organization of a separately capitalized energy affiliate, an organization which would be separately financed but draw on the staff of the bank for its operations. As I remarked earlier, the need and the potential for developing new energy resources presents a major challenge, as well as, I think, a major opportunity to the developing countries and to the world community at large. To meet that challenge and to exploit that opportunity, the bank is now examining the possibility of setting up an energy affiliate. Such an affiliate would serve both as a direct source of finance itself and as a catalyst for other public and private funds. The equity capital of such an organization could come from IBRD profits and from contributions from member governments. Not necessarily by all member governments, and not necessarily in the same proportion as their contribution to the bank's capital. Such an equity base would be utilized to underpin borrowing and lending, which could ultimately amount to a multiple of the scarce equity funds. A third approach would be to raise the bank's lending and borrowing authority again, as was done in 1960, by increasing subscribed stock, but without the necessity of additional paid-in capital. Any one of these 3 actions, or a combination of them, would make it possible for the bank to be more responsive to the urgent needs of its developing countries, needs which were not anticipated when the general capital increase was put forward. The variety of means available should encourage those who, like myself, believe that the current climate of budgetary constraint in the developed nations need not stand in the way of necessary action. While these measures are being studied, because of the urgent need to expand the bank's lending program for the next several years, we should consider drawing forward into that period a portion of the lending presently planned for later years. In this way, we could increase IBRD loans over the next 5 critical years by about $10 billion. Now, implementing these various proposals would allow the IBRD to expand its program. Yet that would not by itself help the bank's poorest member countries, which require highly concessional financing of very long maturity. And as Mr. de la Rosière said, a few billions of dollars can stand in the way of acceptable levels of growth in those countries. The IDA replenishment, while it's very generous, will fall far short of meeting these needs. So just as we need to find a way to exploit more fully IBRD's equity base, so we must also increase the leverage of scarce IDA resources. The creditworthiness of a number of countries which have in the past received IDA credits has now markedly improved. That's most notably the case for oil exporters such as Indonesia and Egypt. But others too have increased their ability to service debt on intermediate terms. Some of these countries could shift in the future to IBRD loans only, or to a different and a softer blend, or a harder blend of IBRD and IDA loans. And this would permit an increase in IDA lending to those countries whose financial requirements have expanded but which are not yet creditworthy for IBRD loans. In this discussion of the role of the bank in the 80s, I have focused on only one aspect of our work, our loans to developing countries and the means of financing them. In the short run, this must have first claim on our attention. But in the longer run, it's the non-financial assistance of the bank that is of even greater value than its financial support, indispensable as that is. As I've said, in the 70s, the bank's policy advice and technical assistance were directed toward the twin goals of accelerating economic growth and reducing absolute poverty. These must continue to be our objectives in the 80s. But the environment in which these goals will be pursued will be so different, so difficult, so complex as I think to require a major shift in the emphasis within the bank. Population growth, although decelerating, will place increasingly heavy burdens on the resources of most developing countries. Labor forces growing at explosive rates, reflecting the past population growth rates, will place a premium on job creation. Migration from the countryside will burden metropolitan areas grown larger than most in the developed world. Widespread malnutrition, if it's to be overcome, will require substantial increases in food production per hectare because opportunities for putting more land under cultivation are sharply reduced. External payments imbalances will require acceleration of industrialization and expansion of exports in the face of slower growth in world trade and rising tides of protectionism. It is shocking to reflect that in spite of the progress of the past quarter century, and in spite of the progress we anticipate in the next 2 decades, it's highly probable that at the end of this century, 600 million human beings in the developing countries will continue to live in absolute poverty. Clearly, there will be an immense intellectual and technical effort required from the bank in the 80s, in addition to its financial contribution, if it is to effectively assist the developing countries to address their fundamental social and economic problems. Development itself, as I've stressed, comprises a twofold task: to accelerate economic growth and to eradicate absolute poverty. In our meetings during the 70s, we've examined the various requirements of these two goals. None of us, of course, can pretend that our understanding of the complexities of the poverty problem is complete. We are still learning. But I do believe that we can take a measure of satisfaction that many governments and many international institutions, including the World Bank, are beginning to think about poverty in a more thoughtful way than we did a decade ago. And we're beginning to ask ourselves how we can reshape our efforts to deal with it more effectively. That should be encouraging to everyone in this room. Due to your support and to that of the governments you represent, the World Bank over the past 10 years has become by far the world's largest and most influential development institution. That is important. But what's far more important is what has transpired throughout the developing world and the millions of individual lives that this institution has touched. What these countless millions of people want, what they need, is what each of us wants and needs: the well-being of those we love, a better future for our children, an end to injustice, and a beginning of hope. We do not see their faces. We do not know their names. We can't count their number. But they are there, and their lives have been touched by us, and ours by them. And now, if I may, let me end on a personal note. These past 13 years have been the most stimulating of my life. And despite the frustrations at times, I wouldn't have traded them for anything. And I want to say to all of you how deeply grateful I am for the privilege of having served with you throughout these years. This bank, born out of the ruins of World War II, has grown into one of the world's most constructive instruments of human aspiration and progress. And yet I believe it's only barely begun to develop its full potential for service and assistance. There is so much more that it can do, that it ought to do, to assist those who need its help. Each one of us here can help make that happen. George Bernard Shaw, I think, put it perfectly. And you may remember he wrote, "You see things and say, why? But I dream things that never were and say, why not?" Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNamara. We shall be shortly be honored by the presence of the President of the United States, who will be addressing us. While he is being met, I would ask all of you to remain in your seats. I would also ask you to remain in your places after the President's address while he's accompanied from the hall. Thank you.